In her last days of strength, Mama Ada whispered a warning into a hidden camera. A marriage built on greed never lasts. She knew her death would be someone's dream come true. She just didn't know the betrayal would begin so quickly, or that the house meant to protect her son would become her own silent battlefield. But before this truth was exposed, let's go back to where it all started. The black SUV rolled through the iron gates of the Okoye mansion just as the sun dipped below the Lagos skyline. Mama Ada pressed her weathered hand against the tinted window, watching the three-story building grow larger with each passing second. She had raised her son Deji in a two-room apartment in Mushin, scrubbing floors at night so he could attend university during the day. Now he was a billionaire, and she was moving into his home because the stairs in her old flat had become too much for her aging knees. Grace stood at the entrance wearing a designer caftan that cost more than Mama Ada's entire wardrobe. Her smile was wide and practiced, the kind wealthy Lagos wives perfected for charity galas and society weddings. She kissed both of Mama Ada's cheeks, leaving faint lipstick marks that felt cold against the old woman's skin. Behind Grace's perfectly lined eyes, something flickered that made Mama Ada's stomach tighten with instinctive dread. The guest room they showed her was larger than her entire former apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured garden. Deji squeezed his mother's shoulder and promised they would have dinner together every evening, just like old times. Grace's smile never reached her eyes as she watched this exchange, her manicured nails tapping against the doorframe in a rhythm that sounded like impatience. Within 3 days, the warmth evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Mama Ada would wake early, hoping to share breakfast with her son before he left for his company headquarters. Grace always appeared first, blocking the hallway with her presence, explaining that Deji had already eaten and rushed out for important meetings. The pattern repeated at lunch and dinner until Mama Ada realized she had not sat across from her son in nearly a week. When Mama Ada asked Grace for help reaching a book from the high shelf in the library, the younger woman sighed so deeply it felt like a slap. Grace handed her the book with barely concealed irritation, muttering something about having staff for such tasks before walking away with sharp clicks of her heels against marble floors. Mama Ada stood alone in that vast library, clutching a book of Igbo proverbs her own mother had given her, wondering if moving here had been a terrible mistake. The maid Chinelo became Mama Ada's only companion in that cold mansion. She was a quiet Anambra girl with gentle hands and eyes that saw everything. When Grace refused to bring Mama Ada her blood pressure medication, Chinelo appeared with the pills and a glass of water without being asked. When the old woman struggled with the complicated shower controls, Chinelo showed her patiently, staying until she was certain Mama Ada felt comfortable. A silent alliance formed between them, built on small kindnesses that felt revolutionary in a house starved of warmth. Mama Ada's gold wedding ring vanished first. She had placed it on the bathroom counter while washing her hands, and when she returned from drying them, the counter was empty. She searched for 2 hours, her arthritic fingers trembling as she checked every surface, every drawer, every corner of her room. Grace appeared in the doorway eventually, asking with false concern what all the commotion was about. When Mama Ada explained, Grace's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise before she suggested that perhaps the old woman had simply forgotten where she put it. That memory fades with age. The antique brooch her grandmother had carried from their ancestral village disappeared next. Then the jade bracelet Deji had given her for her 70th birthday. Each time something vanished, Grace would appear with the same expression of polite concern mixed with subtle accusation. She began suggesting that Mama Ada should keep her door locked, implying that perhaps the staff could not be trusted with such valuable items lying around. When the heirloom coral beads went missing, Grace's performance shifted dramatically. She summoned all the household staff to the living room, her voice sharp as broken glass as she interrogated them about the theft. Her eyes kept returning to Chinelo, who stood with her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly together. Grace accused the young maid directly, threatening to search her quarters and call the police if the beads did not reappear immediately. Chinelo's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, just shook her head slowly while Grace's voice grew louder and crueler. Mama Ada watched this scene from the staircase landing, her heart pounding with recognition. She had seen bullies before, had raised her son to never become one, but somehow her daughter-in-law had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as justice. That night, Mama Ada found Chinelo crying silently in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. The old woman sat beside her and took her hand, whispering that she knew the truth, that good people always recognize each other in houses full of lies. The next afternoon, Mama Ada was returning from the garden when she heard a sharp cry from behind the kitchen door. She pushed it open quietly and saw Grace with her fingers pinched tightly around Chinelo's upper arm, her nails digging into the young woman's dark skin hard enough to leave marks. Grace was hissing in something about incompetence and laziness, about how easily maids could be replaced in a city full of desperate girls needing work. She released Chinelo only when she noticed Mama Ada standing there, then smoothed her dress and walked past both of them without a word of explanation or shame. Meals became another battlefield in Grace's quiet war. Dinner was served in the massive dining room with its crystal chandelier and seating for 16 people. Deji and Grace sat at one end, talking about business deals and society events, while Mama Ada's place was set at the far opposite end, so distant she could barely hear their conversation. She ate alone in that crowd, watching her son laugh at his wife's comments while Grace's hand rested possessively on his arm. Sometimes Grace would glance down the long table at Mama Ada with a look that clearly communicated, "You are a burden we tolerate, nothing more." One evening when Deji was traveling to Abuja for meetings, Grace did not bother with pretense at all. She had the staff serve Mama Ada's dinner on a tray in her room, claiming it would be more comfortable for the old woman to eat privately. Mama Ada sat on her bed with that tray across her lap, staring at food that tasted like humiliation. Through her closed door, she could hear Grace laughing on the phone with friends, making plans for parties and shopping trips, living a life that had no room for aging mothers-in-law. That same night, Mama Ada could not sleep. She rose to get water from the kitchen around midnight and heard Grace's voice drifting from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and the old woman found herself standing in the hallway, listening to a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. Grace was speaking to someone in a low, excited voice about investments and properties and bank accounts. Then came the words that confirmed every instinct of danger Mama Ada had felt since arriving. "Once she's gone, everything is mine. The old woman won't last much longer anyway, and Deji will need me more than ever. All of this becomes ours completely." Mama Ada backed away from that door on trembling legs, her hand pressed against her mouth to keep from gasping aloud. She made it back to her room and locked the door with shaking fingers, then sat on the edge of her bed as her mind raced through terrible implications. Grace was not just cruel or greedy, she was actively waiting for Mama Ada to die, perhaps even planning to speed that death along. The old woman had survived poverty and widowhood and countless hardships, but she had never felt as unsafe as she did in her billionaire son's mansion. Comment: justice if you believe evil never wins. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the ending. Morning came with sharp clarity about what needed to be done. Mama Ada waited until Grace left for her tennis lesson at the country club, then called her old lawyer, Barrister Okonkwo, who had handled her affairs for 30 years. She spoke quickly and quietly, explaining that she needed to update her will immediately and that it must be done in absolute secrecy. The lawyer arrived that afternoon through the service entrance, looking concerned at the urgency in her voice, but asking no questions beyond what the law required. Mama Ada had accumulated more than people realized over the decades. Properties her late husband had left her, investments she had made wisely, savings she had never touched even during difficult times. She had always planned to leave everything to Deji, but now she saw clearly what that would mean. Grace would control it all, would waste money earned through suffering and sacrifice on designer handbags and luxury vacations while forgetting the woman who had made it all possible. Mama Ada could not allow that disrespect to be her legacy. The new will was simple and devastating. Chinelo, who had shown more love and care in 3 weeks than Grace had managed in 3 years, would inherit the bulk of Mama Ida's estate. There were provisions for Deji because he was still her son, still the boy she had raised despite his current blindness to his wife's true nature. But the majority would go to the young maid who brought medication without being asked, who sat with a lonely old woman in kitchens after midnight, who showed that kindness still existed in a world of expensive cruelty. Barrister Okonkwo prepared the documents with professional discretion, raising his eyebrows only slightly when he saw Chinelo's name listed as primary beneficiary. Mama Ada signed each page with firm strokes, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. She placed one sealed copy in the lawyer's briefcase and kept another locked in her room. Then she asked the barrister about one more thing, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Could he recommend someone who installed security cameras, the hidden kind that recorded everything without being obvious? The security technician arrived 2 days later, posing as a handyman there to fix faulty electrical outlets. Grace was out shopping with friends, and Deji was locked in video conferences in his office. Mama Ada watched as tiny cameras were installed in the study, where she kept her important documents in corners of the living room and hallways, positioned to capture faces and actions without being detected. The technician showed her how to access the footage on a tablet he left with her, hidden inside a hollowed-out devotional book on her nightstand. That evening, Mama Ada sat alone in her room and recorded a video message on the same tablet. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. She explained everything she had witnessed, every cruelty from Grace, every item that had disappeared, every poisonous word she had overheard. She spoke about Chinelo's kindness and why the will had been changed. She looked into that camera lens and said clearly, "If something happens to me, if I die suddenly or unexpectedly, this is the truth of what my final days were like. A marriage built on greed never lasts, and a house without love is just an expensive grave." The poisoning started so subtly that at first Mama Ada thought it was just bad luck with her digestion. A cup of tea Grace personally brought her one morning left her stomach cramping for hours. Soup served at dinner made her violently ill that night, though everyone else ate from the same pot without problem. A glass of juice Grace insisted she drink with her medication sent her running to the bathroom with dizziness and nausea that lasted until dawn. Chinelo noticed first, her eyes widening with horror when she saw Mama Ada gripping the bathroom sink, too weak to stand fully upright. The maid said nothing but began quietly disposing of any food or drink Grace brought directly to the old woman, replacing it with meals she prepared herself in secret. For 3 days this protection worked, and Mama Ada began to feel stronger. But Grace was watching too, noticing the food going untouched, seeing Chinelo's increased presence around the old woman. The attack came disguised as reconciliation. Grace appeared at Mama Ada's door one evening with a tray of pepper soup, claiming she felt terrible about the distance between them and wanted to make amends. Her smile was warm and convincing, her voice dripping with false regret, as she explained she had made this soup herself, using Mama Ada's late husband's favorite recipe that Deji had once mentioned. She stood there watching, waiting, insisting that Mama Ada try it, while it was still hot. Mama Ada looked at that bowl of rich red soup and saw death floating in the palm oil sheen. But Grace was blocking the doorway, and her eyes had gone hard despite the smile still fixed on her face. The old woman understood she had no choice that would not reveal her suspicions too early. She lifted the spoon to her lips and swallowed, tasting pepper and herbs and something bitter underneath that made her throat want to close. Grace watched her eat 3 full spoonfuls before finally leaving with a satisfied smile, taking the tray and closing the door softly behind her. Within an hour, Mama Ada could not feel her legs. The numbness crept upward like rising water, through her hips and into her chest, until even breathing became a conscious effort. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, not enough to reach beyond her closed door. Her right arm stopped responding entirely, then her left. She slumped sideways on her bed, fully conscious and aware, but trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed her commands. Chinelo found her during evening rounds, when she always checked to see if Mama Ada needed anything before bed. The maid's scream brought the entire household running. Grace appeared last, still in her evening dress from dinner, her expression arranged into shock and concern that might have fooled anyone who had not seen her deliver that fatal soup hours earlier. She immediately took charge, calling for the family doctor, shooing away staff, touching Mama Ada's forehead with hands that felt like ice against feverish skin. The doctor diagnosed a severe stroke, praising Grace for her quick response and attentive care. He prescribed medications and bed rest, suggesting that at Mama Ada's age, such incidents were sadly common and often the beginning of a final decline. Grace nodded solemnly through all of this, playing the devoted daughter-in-law with Oscar-worthy conviction. Only Chinelo saw the tiny smile that flickered across Grace's face when the doctor mentioned that recovery was unlikely, that the family should prepare themselves for the worst. Mama Ada lay paralyzed in that bedroom while life continued around her. She could hear everything, understand everything, but could not speak or move or even blink deliberately to communicate. Grace made sure she was fed and cleaned, but only when others were watching. When they were alone, Grace would sit beside the bed and speak in that same cold voice Mama Ada had overheard on the phone. She talked about funeral arrangements she was already planning, about how the house would be redecorated once the old woman was gone, about finally having Deji completely to herself without his mother's disappointing presence weighing everything down. Chinelo cried silently while bathing Mama Ada, her tears falling onto the old woman's unmoving arms as she worked. She brought fresh flowers for the nightstand every morning and read aloud from the Bible every evening, her voice shaking with grief for someone still alive but already being mourned. She adjusted pillows and smoothed blankets and held Mama Ada's limp hand for hours, providing the only comfort available in that expensive prison of a bedroom. Deji visited twice daily, sitting beside his mother's bed with his head in his hands, looking exhausted and helpless. Grace was always there too, standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, stroking his hair, reminding him that his mother had lived a good long life, and that he should feel grateful for the time they'd had. She was already rewriting history, turning herself into the compassionate wife supporting her husband through inevitable tragedy while erasing her own role in creating that tragedy. 3 weeks passed in this frozen hell. Mama Ada existed in a state between living and dying, aware of every indignity, every false tear Grace shed for visitors, every moment Deji spent grieving a mother who was still conscious enough to hear him. The old woman's mind remained sharp, even as her body betrayed her completely, trapped with her thoughts and memories and rage at the injustice of being murdered slowly in her own son's home. Then Grace overheard something that changed her timeline. She was eavesdropping outside the study when Deji took a call from Barrister Okonkwo. the lawyer mentioning something about Mama Ada's updated will and asking when would be appropriate to discuss the contents with the family. Grace's face went pale, then flushed with panic. She had not known about any new will, had assumed everything would pass through Deji and therefore to her. The possibility that Mama Ada had changed things before the stroke sent Grace spiraling into desperate calculation. That night, after Deji fell asleep exhausted from another day of watching his mother deteriorate, Grace lay awake running through options. She had to find that will and destroy it before anyone read the contents. Whatever changes Mama Ada had made could ruin everything Grace had worked for, every sacrifice she had made in marrying a man she found boring just because he was rich. She would not let some bitter old woman steal her future from beyond the grave. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Grace waited until 2 a.m, when even the security guards were drowsy at their posts. She slipped out of the master bedroom wearing dark clothes, moving through the mansion like a shadow, returning home. The study where Deji kept important family documents was locked, but Grace had stolen his key weeks ago and had a copy made. She turned it slowly in the lock, wincing at every tiny click and scrape of metal on metal, then pushed the door open and slipped inside. The study was dark except for moonlight filtering through plantation shutters. Grace pulled out her phone and used its flashlight to search through filing cabinets and desk drawers, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. She found bank statements and business contracts and property deeds, but nothing labeled as Mama Ada's will. Frustration built in her chest like steam in a sealed pot, making her movements less careful, more desperate. Finally, in the bottom drawer of an antique cabinet, she found a manila envelope sealed with red wax and marked with Barrister Okonkwo's law firm stamp. Grace's breath came faster as she broke the seal and pulled out the document inside. Her eyes scanned the legal language quickly, stumbling over whereas and heretofore until she reached the section listing beneficiaries. Her own name was nowhere on the pages, but Chinello's appeared again and again, attached to properties and accounts and investments Grace had been mentally spending for years. Rage replaced panic, turning Grace's vision red around the edges. That ungrateful maid, that nobody from nowhere who should have been grateful just to have employment, was stealing Grace's entire future. The injustice of it, the absolute betrayal from a woman Grace had tolerated in her home out of basic Christian charity, made her hands clench so hard the papers crumpled. She would not accept this, would not let it stand, would burn this evil document and let the old will stand, the one that left everything to Deji and therefore to his wife. Grace moved to Deji's desk and found his lighter in the top drawer where he kept emergency candles for when NEPA took the power. She flicked it once, twice, watching the small flame dance in the darkness. Then she held the corner of the will to that flame and watched fire catch and spread, eating through legal language and signatures and witness statements. The paper curled and blackened, turning Mama Ada's final wishes into ash and smoke. She was so focused on watching the will burn that she did not notice the tiny red light blinking in the corner of the room, or hear the silent alarm that transmitted immediately to Deji's phone upstairs. The hidden camera captured everything in crisp digital clarity. Grace breaking into the study, rifling through documents, finding the will, and setting it on fire with methodical determination. Every crime was recorded and transmitted and saved to secure cloud storage that could never be erased or denied. Deji woke to his phone buzzing with urgent alerts from the security system. He grabbed it confused and half asleep, seeing notifications about unauthorized access to the study and motion detected and heat sensors triggered. He pulled up the live camera feed and saw his wife standing in the dark study with a burning document in her hands, her face illuminated by flames that turned her features into something he did not recognize. He moved faster than he had moved in years, throwing on clothes and running down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. His bare feet slapped against marble floors as he raced through the dark house toward the study. Behind him, he heard Chinello's door open and her frightened voice asking what was happening, but he did not stop to answer. His mind could not process what he was seeing, could not make it make sense with the woman he thought he had married. Deji burst through the study door and slammed on the lights, flooding the room with brightness that made Grace spin around like a criminal caught mid-crime. She stood frozen in the center of the room with half-burned papers still smoking in her hands and guilt written across her face in letters too large to hide. The lighter sat on the desk beside her, silver and damning. Ash floated in the air between them like evidence taking flight. Grace tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for explanations that would not come. Deji stared at her, then at the remains of legal documents burning in her grip, then back at her face as understanding crashed over him in waves. His mother's sudden illness, the missing jewelry, Chinello's tears, the coldness he had been too busy to notice or too comfortable to address, all of it suddenly recontextualized into a pattern he should have seen months ago. He reached for his phone again, his hands shaking with rage and betrayal, and pulled up the security footage. The entire household had gathered outside the study door now, staff in nightclothes and robes, Chinello with her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Deji held up his phone and played the video for everyone to see, his voice breaking as he narrated what the silent footage showed. His wife destroying his mother's will, erasing her final wishes, committing crimes he could barely name through the anger closing his throat. But there was more, and the security technician had done his job well. The hidden cameras had been recording for weeks, capturing footage Deji had never thought to check before this moment. He scrolled back through saved files and found everything. Grace pinching Chinello until she cried. Grace dumping Mama Ada's medication in the trash. Grace bringing soup to his mother's room with that terrible, satisfied smile. Grace on the phone discussing plans for after the old woman died. The crowd behind him gasped and cried out as each new clip played. Chinello sank to her knees in the hallway, sobbing with vindication and grief. The night security guard called the police without being asked. The cook who had prepared so many meals reached out to steady herself against the wall. Everyone was seeing who Grace really was, and there was no expensive caftan or society connection that could save her from the truth displayed on that small screen. Then Deji found the video message his mother had recorded, and his hands went still on the phone. Mama Ada's face filled the screen, old and tired, but clear-eyed and determined. She spoke directly to him, explaining why she had changed the will, detailing every cruelty she had witnessed and endured. She told him about Chinello's kindness, about Grace's greed, about feeling unsafe in his home. Her voice was strong, despite the trembling camera, and her final words hit him like physical blows. I raised you to recognize goodness and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I hope you remember those lessons before it is too late. Deji played that video 3 times, tears streaming down his face as he listened to his mother explain how she had been treated in his house while he was too distracted with business and too trusting of his wife to notice. Grace tried to approach him once, reaching out to touch his arm, but he jerked away from her like she carried a disease. His eyes, when he finally looked at her, were empty of everything that had once been there. Love and trust and partnership all burned away like that will in her guilty hands. The police arrived as dawn was breaking over Lagos, their sirens shattering the wealthy neighborhood's usual silence. Grace's arrest was not gentle or discreet. They handcuffed her in front of the entire staff, reading charges that included theft, attempted murder, destruction of legal documents, and fraud. She tried to maintain dignity as they led her out, but her designer nightgown and smudged makeup, and the ash still staining her fingers, told a story that no amount of composure could contradict. Deji stood in his study, surrounded by evidence of his wife's crimes and his own blindness, holding his phone with his mother's final message still paused on the screen. Chinelo appeared in the doorway, hesitant and uncertain, her eyes red from crying. He looked at this young woman his mother had chosen over her own son, this maid who had shown more love and loyalty than his wife of 3 years. And he finally understood the lesson Mama Ada had been trying to teach him. The lawyer arrived that afternoon with copies of the will that Grace had tried to destroy, the original safely stored in his office vault where fire could not reach it. Barrister Okonkwo sat across from Deji and explained the contents, watching the billionaire's face as he learned that his mother had left the bulk of her estate to the maid. The old lawyer expected anger or confusion, but Deji only nodded slowly, recognizing that this was justice wearing an unexpected face. In her bedroom, Mama Ada remained paralyzed and silent, but now Chinelo sat beside her bed, holding her hand and weeping with different tears. The maid whispered that justice had come, that Grace had been caught and arrested, that the will had survived, that everything Mama Ada had planned had worked. The old woman could not respond with words or movements, but something shifted in her eyes, a light returning that had been absent since the poisoning. The doctors could not explain what happened over the following weeks. Mama Ada, who they had written off as terminal and fading, began to recover with inexplicable speed. Feeling returned to her fingers first, then her toes, spreading inward until she could squeeze Chinelo's hand weakly. Her voice came back in whispers, then words, then full sentences that she used to tell her son everything Grace had done in detail that made the footage seem merciful by comparison. Grace's trial became a society scandal of the year, splashed across newspapers and blogs and dinner party conversations throughout Lagos. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to deny. Video footage, testimony from staff, financial records showing stolen jewelry sold to private dealers, medical reports suggesting Mama Ada's stroke symptoms were consistent with certain poisons. Grace's expensive lawyers tried everything, but no defense works against crimes recorded in high definition and backed by witnesses queuing up to testify. Deji filed for divorce before the trial even concluded, his petition citing fraud, attempted murder, and irreconcilable differences that felt like the understatement of the decade. He moved his mother into the master suite and took a smaller room himself, insisting that she should have the best space in a house that had treated her like a burden. He doubled Chinelo's salary and gave her the day off every Sunday, and thanked her hourly for saving his mother's life with simple human kindness. The court sentenced Grace to 15 years in prison, though she would be eligible for parole in 8. Her society friends abandoned her immediately, removing her from their WhatsApp groups and pretending they had never been close. Her family tried to visit once, but Grace refused to see them, unable to face the disappointment and shame in their eyes. She sat in her cell wearing prison clothes instead of designer caftans, and learned too late that greed costs more than it ever pays. Mama Ada threw a party on the day her recovery was declared complete, inviting everyone who had stood by her and no one who had not. Chinelo wore a new dress bought with money from her inheritance, still not quite believing that she had gone from maid to heiress in the span of months. The young woman tried to refuse the money, insisting she had only done what any good person would do, but Mama Ada squeezed her hand and said quietly that good people deserved good things, and that was the entire point. Deji stood on the balcony overlooking the party, watching his mother laugh with guests and feeling ashamed of how close he had come to losing her. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had not noticed his home becoming a prison for the woman who had built him. He promised himself and her that he would never be that blind again, that wealth meant nothing if it bought only cruelty and isolation. Chinelo found him there and asked if he was angry that his mother had left so much to a maid instead of to him. Deji looked at this young woman who had protected his mother when he had failed to, who had shown love when his wife had shown poison, and he smiled for the first time in weeks. He told her that his mother had taught him one final lesson about recognizing goodness, and that he was grateful for the teacher, even if the lesson had come wrapped in pain. Mama Ada joined them on the balcony as the sun set over Lagos, the three of them standing together watching the city lights come on like stars falling upward. The old woman had faced death disguised as family and had survived through planning and courage and one young woman's kindness. She had rewritten her legacy to reward loyalty over blood, and in doing so had saved more than just her possessions. She had saved the idea that goodness still mattered, that evil would be caught, that hidden cameras and human conscience would always find a way to expose truth. Below them, the party continued, full of people who had stood beside Mama Ada and when standing beside her was dangerous. The maid who became an heiress, the security guard who installed cameras without questions, the cook who had noticed when food made someone sick, the lawyer who kept secrets safe. They celebrated justice served and karma delivered, and the simple fact that sometimes the evil plan fails and the good people win. Grace sat in her cell that night, thinking about the will she had tried to burn and the life she had tried to steal. She thought about the hidden cameras she never saw and the consequences she never believed would come. She had been so certain that money and marriage would protect her, that old women were easy targets and maids were powerless. She had learned too late that cameras see everything, that justice sometimes hides in book-shaped tablets, and that the person you underestimate might be the one who brings you down. In a world where money can buy luxury, but not loyalty, this story reminds us, evil may rise fast, but it always falls harder. If you watch till the end, comment Karma 1 to show that you believe wickedness never truly succeeds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so more people remember, good hearts always win in the end.